wealthiest man in the county was freezing to death on his banished brother's porch, slamming his frostbitten hands against a heavy door and begging to enter the very cornstalk trash pile he had spent 4 months mocking. Standing inside his quiet 62-degree room with an iron bar in his hands, the younger brother didn't open the door right away. Because 4 months ago, when he turned discarded farm weeds into an airtight fortress, the entire town swore he would freeze to death. 4 months before the Arctic front locked the Blackwood Valley of Kansas under 3 feet of solid ice, the legacy of old Samuel Vance was carved up on a kitchen table beneath a pale autumn sky in late September 1887. The reading of the estate was swift, cold, and brutally simple. Gideon Vance, the 38-year-old elder brother, claimed everything of value. The sprawling 2-story oak mansion was his. The 300 head of beef cattle, the full grain mills, the deep stone well, and every productive acre of bottomland belonged to him. Sitting across the scarred table was 32-year-old Arthur Vance, his 29-year-old wife Martha, their 7-year-old son Leo, and Grizzly, a massive, rough-coated Newfoundland and Retriever hybrid pressed tight against the boy's knees. Arthur was a quiet, observant man, a former mason's helper and blacksmith whose hands carried the calluses of heavy physical labor. When the reading finished, Arthur's entire inheritance amounted to an old, lame mule, a wooden cart with a cracked axle, an acre of barren, gravel-strewn dirt at the mouth of Dead Man's Gulch, and exactly 12 silver dollars. Gideon pushed the few coins across the table, a thin, patronizing smile touching his lips beneath his trimmed mustache. "Charity for a man born to fail," Gideon said softly, his voice carrying the calm arrogance of a man who believed wealth was a mark of moral superiority. "Take your $12, Arthur. Try not to starve before the frost sets in." Little Leo looked up at his mother, his small hand clutching her apron. "Is Uncle Gideon taking grandfather's house?" Martha did not answer. She simply placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder, her gray eyes steady and unyielding. Arthur didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or demand fairness. He quietly gathered the silver coins into his wool pocket, picked up his father's worn, leather-bound farm ledger from the counter, and stood up. He did not look at his brother. He looked past the warm, glowing hearth of his childhood home and stared out the window toward the desolate northern horizon, where the autumn wind was already gathering its icy strength. They had $12, a broken cart, and winter was barely 2 months away. The next morning, Arthur led his family onto the barren acre at Dead Man's Gulch. The land barely looked capable of feeding prairie dogs, much less a family of 3. Dry gravel covered the slopes, punctuated only by scattered patches of withered sagebrush and twisted weeds that had given up trying to grow. There was no house, no barn, no well. A problem revealed itself before Arthur could drive a single iron stake into the ground. By noon, he stood inside the town store while Tobias Carr, Blackwood's 50-year-old head carpenter, added up figures on a piece of slate. Framing studs, pine siding, nails, tar paper, a stovepipe. The numbers climbed relentlessly. A cabin barely large enough for a family of 3 would cost a minimum of $140 in materials alone. Arthur possessed 12. Tobias Carr wiped the slate clean with the palm of his hand and looked over the counter with a heavy sigh. "A family needs proper timber walls, Arthur. Studs, tar paper, and tight chinking. Anything less and a Kansas winter will find every gap. Sell the gravel plot to Gideon. He'll give you $30 for it. Work as a hired hand for your brother through the cold and start over in the spring." Arthur looked at the head builder. "My family won't sleep in Gideon's barn as beggars, Tobias." Tobias removed his felt hat and rubbed the back of his neck. "A child doesn't care about pride when 30 below gets into his bones, Arthur. You may be right in your heart, but you'll lose your boy by morning if a real whiteout catches you without walls." The words landed heavier than any insult, but Arthur's expression did not change. Back at Dead Man's Gulch, Arthur tried alternative methods. He spent a full day trying to cut sod bricks along the dry creek bed, but the gravelly soil lacked root density. The moment he lifted a cut sod brick, it crumbled into dry dust between his fingers. In desperation, Arthur rode his lame mule over to Gideon's grand farm to ask about buying leftover straw or wild hay with his remaining silver dollars. Gideon stood by his massive timber barn, watching his hired hands load wagons with prime wheat straw. When Arthur made his request, Gideon let out a sharp, mocking laugh that drew the attention of every hand in the yard. "Buy my straw?" Gideon sneered, kicking aside a large mound of damp, moldy, discarded corn stalks that had been thrown behind the manure pile. "You want to pretend you're a real builder, little brother? Take that trash. Those rotting corn stalks suit a beggar better than good timber." The hired hands laughed, turning back to their work. Arthur stood in the mud, looking down at the discarded pile of yellow corn stalks. The stalks were thick, stiff, and wet from autumn rain, completely worthless for stock feed or bedding. Arthur did not answer his brother's mockery. He simply bent down, picked up an armful of the damp, heavy stalks, and began loading them into his broken wooden cart. "Build a house out of weeds if you want, Arthur," Gideon shouted after him as the cart creaked away. "One stalk, then another, then another. We'll see if your trash pile keeps the frost out in February." By the time Arthur dragged the full cart back to Dead Man's Gulch, the laughter from his brother's farm had faded into the quiet hiss of the prairie wind. Arthur set the heavy bundle of corn stalks on the dirt. He reached into his coat, pulled out his pocket knife, and sliced a thick stalk down the middle. Inside the tough outer skin was a dense, white, fibrous pith, a porous, sponge-like core filled with millions of microscopic, hollow cellular chambers. Arthur rolled the pith between his thumb and forefinger. He pulled a second stalk, then a third. Every single one carried the same structure. He opened his father's ledger to a page written 20 years earlier. In old Samuel Vance's faded handwriting was a single sentence: "Wind steals what it can touch. Still air is the blanket." Arthur looked from the ledger to the pile of discarded corn stalks resting in the dust. A quiet, revolutionary realization began to take shape in his mind. He wasn't looking at farm trash. He was looking at millions of tiny, sealed chambers of still air waiting to be bound together into a wall. That night, sitting beside a small campfire at Dead Man's Gulch, Arthur Vance used his pocket knife to demonstrate the physics of the stalk to his wife. "A solid pine log conducts cold straight through its wood fibers, Martha," Arthur explained, holding a piece of dried pith near the yellow flame. "It fights the winter with sheer density, but inside these hollow corn stalks are millions of microscopic, sealed air cells. Air that cannot move, cannot transfer cold. If we compress these stalks into dense bales and seal them against wind, we aren't building with weeds, we're building with trapped air." Martha looked at the dried stalk, then at her husband's calm, confident eyes. "Will it hold a roof, Arthur?" "It will hold a mountain if the geometry is right," he answered softly. The next morning, Arthur rode his lame mule to the forest edge to visit Lydia Finch. Lydia was 68 years old, a former pioneer midwife and herbalist who lived alone in a small, well-kept stone dugout near the creek. She was a woman who remembered the early territorial days before sawmills arrived, when settlers built shelters out of whatever the earth provided. Lydia stood by her outdoor stone hearth, watching Arthur unload his mule. "I heard Gideon threw his corn trash at you, Arthur," she said, her voice dry as crackling leaves. "He thinks he gave you garbage." "He gave me insulation, Mrs. Finch," Arthur replied. "I need a plaster that won't crack when the freeze hits, and something that keeps rodents from chewing the stalks." Lydia gave a short, raspy chuckle. She walked to her shed and pointed to 3 wooden barrels filled with a fine gray powder gathered from the old volcanic ash beds along the riverbank. "In the early days, before men got soft on pine boards, we mixed fine volcanic ash with river clay, coarse salt, and chopped buffalo grass," Lydia explained, scooping up a handful of the gray ash. "The ash is full of natural silica. The salt draws ambient moisture to cure the clay, while the silica and ash turn the outer surface into a hard, ceramic skin. Water can't penetrate it, and no mouse will touch a wall full of salt." Arthur spent the afternoon repairing the roof beams on Lydia's woodshed. In exchange, she gave him 2 sacks of coarse rock salt, 3 barrels of volcanic ash, and a bundle of dried wild mint to mix into the foundation plaster to repel insects. With materials secured, the real labor began at Dead Man's Gulch. Arthur constructed 2 heavy wooden compression boxes out of old wagon planks. Using a hand-lever winch, he packed the dried corn stalks into dense rectangular bales measuring 20 inches thick, 3 feet long, and 16 inches high, binding each bale tightly with iron wire. He laid a low, level foundation skirt of river boulders along the perimeter of a 14 by 18-foot floor plan to keep the bottom bales off the bare dirt. Then came the stacking. Arthur laid the dense cornstalk bales flat along the rock foundation, staggering the vertical joints exactly like a bricklayer laying stone. As each layer rose, he drove 4-foot split cedar stakes down through the bales, pinning the layers together into a solid, interlocking mass. Martha and 7-year-old Leo worked right beside him. In a large wooden trough, Martha mixed the volcanic ash, river clay, rock salt, and chopped buffalo grass with water pulled from the creek. Leo carried small wooden paddles, scooping the gray plaster while his mother smoothed a thick 2-inch coat over both the interior and exterior surfaces of the cornstalk walls. Grizzly, the big Newfoundland hybrid, sat near the work area, his dark eyes watching the road, his tail thumping against the dirt whenever Leo brought him a fresh stick. As the walls grew higher and thicker, word spread across Blackwood Valley. Travelers on the high road slowed their horses to stare. They called it the Cornstalk Nest and the Beggar's Barn. One afternoon, Tobias Carr, the head carpenter who had quoted Arthur $140 for lumber, rode out to the claim accompanied by 2 local builders. Tobias dismounted, walked up to the 6-foot-high plaster-covered wall, and looked at it with open skepticism. "You're building a pig pen out of farm trash, Vance," Tobias scoffed, shaking his head. "One heavy rain will turn this mud into slop, and the first winter gale will blow these weeds across the prairie." Arthur did not stop his work. He was using a wooden trowel to smooth a section of volcanic plaster near the door frame. "Test the wall, Tobias." Tobias frowned. He stepped up to the 20-inch thick cornstalk wall, set his shoulder against the plastered surface, and shoved with all his weight. The wall did not budge. It felt as solid and immovable as a granite ledge. Tobias pushed a second time, putting his full 200-pound frame into the effort. The cornstalk structure remained completely motionless, absorbing the force without a single crack appearing in the fresh plaster. Tobias stepped back, brushing gray ash dust from his coat sleeve. His eyebrows narrowed in surprise, though he quickly masked his astonishment with a frown. "Standing in October ain't the same as standing in February, Vance," Tobias muttered, mounting his horse. "We'll see what's left of your weed house when 30 below hits." He rode away, but he did not laugh as he headed down the road. For the first time, the head builder realized that the Beggar's Barn possessed a weight that had nothing to do with pine boards. By the first week of November, the cornstalk cabin reached its full height. Arthur secured heavy cottonwood roof poles across the top, covering the frame with 2 layers of heavy tarred canvas, held down by a dense cap of cut prairie sod. Inside, Martha transformed the rough shelter into a home. A woven blanket separated the sleeping area. A small cast-iron stove stood on river rocks near the north wall, its pipe extending through a stone-lined collar in the roof. Leo claimed a corner for his bed, while Grizzly chose a spot near the heavy oak door where drafts were most likely to appear. Then came the first real weather test, a 3-day driving autumn rain that swept across the Blackwood Valley with cold, relentless force. In town, men gathered around the stove at Hiram Bell's store, predicting that Arthur's mud and weed house would melt into a pile of slop before sunrise. Gideon Vance sat in his carriage along the high road, watching Dead Man's Gulch through a brass spyglass, waiting to see his brother's dream washed away. When the rain finally stopped on the 4th morning, Arthur stepped outside to inspect the damage. The volcanic ash plaster had not washed away. The salt within the mixture had drawn the rainwater into the clay, triggering a chemical reaction with the natural silica that cured the plaster into a smooth, slate-hard shell. The 20-inch thick cornstalk walls were completely dry inside. However, Arthur discovered a flaw. Rainwater dripping from the canvas roof eaves had pooled along the northern dirt foundation. Grizzly trotted along the north wall, barking aggressively and digging at the wet earth. Arthur knelt beside the dog and pulled back a section of loose mud. A pair of field mice had attempted to burrow beneath the lower edge where the dirt had softened. Arthur did not waste time defending the original design. He spent the next 3 days changing it. He dug a 2-foot gravel trench around the entire outer perimeter of the cabin to carry water away from the structure. He gathered heavy granite boulders from the gulch and built a low protective stone skirt 2 feet high along the base of the walls. Finally, he mixed an extra thick batch of plaster containing double the rock salt, wood ash, and volcanic silica, smearing it over the lower stone skirt. The gravel trench carried every drop of runoff 20 yards down the gulch, and the heavy salt concentration in the lower plaster burned the mice's noses, forcing them to abandon the foundation completely. When Gideon learned that Arthur's home had survived the storm and was holding 20 degrees warmer than the outdoor air, his irritation turned into dark fury. He could not tolerate the sight of his banished brother thriving on trash, proving to the valley that expensive timber from his mill was unnecessary. Past midnight on the third Tuesday of November, the sky was pitch black, heavy with the bitter chill that precedes a great freeze. Gideon sent two of his heaviest sawmill hands up Dead Man's Gulch. They carried a gallon jug of coal oil and a rag-wrapped torch. Their orders were simple. Splash the coal oil against the north wall of Arthur's cornstalk house, light it, and run. It would be written off as a stovepipe accident, proof positive that Arthur's weed pile was a fire trap. The two saboteurs crept up to the north wall under the cover of darkness. One opened the jug and splashed a generous coating of coal oil over the plaster surface. The second struck a match against his trousers, lit the torch, and hurled it directly against the wall. He expected an explosion of flame. He expected the dry cornstalks underneath to roar like a bonfire. Inside the cabin, Grizzly let out a low, chest-rumbling bark. Arthur sprang out of bed, grabbed an iron crowbar from the corner, and stepped to the window. Outside, a strange phenomenon unfolded. The coal oil flared up in a brief, brilliant yellow flash, burning away the surface fuel in a matter of seconds. But when the liquid fuel burned out, the wall itself did not catch fire. The intense heat of the torch had acted like a kiln on the volcanic ash plaster. The silica within the ash and the mineral salt fused together under the flame, vitrifying into a glossy, glass-hard black ceramic shield. The 20-inch layer of compressed cornstalks underneath remained completely untouched, protected by the heat-resistant glaze. The torch fell into the wet gravel and died with a weak hiss. The two sawmill hands stared at the blackened, glowing, unburned wall in sheer terror. "She's cursed!" one of them gasped, dropping his empty jug into the mud. "The damn weed house won't burn!" They turned and fled down the gulch into the dark as fast as their boots could carry them, convinced the widower had used dark magic to protect his stone-hard walls. When dawn broke, Arthur walked outside to examine the north wall. The spot where the torch had struck was black, shiny, and hard as river slate. He tapped the vitrified surface with his iron crowbar. The tool bounced off with a high, metallic ring, leaving not a single crack. Martha walked out beside him, holding Leo's hand, staring at the shiny black patch on the wall. "Gideon tried to burn us out?" Arthur touched the vitrified ceramic glaze and smiled quietly for the first time in months. "He tried to destroy it, Martha. All he did was turn our plaster into stone." February 12, 1888, arrived beneath a Kansas sky the color of old iron. The barometer hanging beside Arthur's front door had been falling since midnight, the mercury plunging to levels no one in the Blackwood Valley had ever seen. By noon, the wind had died completely. The prairie entered a state of terrifying, motionless silence, the held breath before the plains exhaled pure Arctic violence. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the storm struck. It did not arrive as soft snowfall. It came as the great Arctic whiteout, a 65-mile-an-hour gale driving razor-sharp ice crystals across the land in a blinding, horizontal curtain. Within 2 hours, the temperature plunged from 20 degrees above zero to 35 degrees below zero. Down in the valley, the illusion of Gideon Vance's wealth turned into a cold nightmare. Gideon's grand 2-story oak mansion had been constructed from unseasoned pine and oak planks. Under the intense, sub-zero cold, the green timber contracted rapidly, shrinking and pulling the clay chinking out from between the logs. Freezing wind poured into every room like water through a broken dam. Gideon's hired hands burned through his entire 2-cord wood reserve in 12 hours, trying to heat rooms where the draft stripped heat faster than the fires could produce it. In desperation, they chopped up mahogany dining tables, oak sideboards, and grain crates to feed the roaring stoves. At midnight on the second day, the overheated iron stovepipe on the second floor ignited the dry pine rafters. Half the roof caught fire, burning away before the gale blew the flames out, leaving the upper floor to collapse inward under tons of drifted snow. Gideon, his wife, his 2 children, and Tobias Carr, who had taken shelter at the mansion, were forced into a corner of the ground floor, huddled under wet wool blankets in a freezing, snow-filled ice cave where the temperature dropped to 20 below zero. 4 miles away at Dead Man's Gulch, Arthur's cornstalk fortress was performing a miracle of fluid thermodynamics. The 20-inch thick walls of compressed cornstalks contained millions of microscopic, sealed air chambers. The 65-mile-an-hour wind slammed against the vitrified volcanic ash plaster, but it could not find a single crack or seam. The aerodynamic drag was absorbed and scattered across the smooth, stone-hard exterior. Inside the cabin, the brass thermometer read a steady, unwavering 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The small cast-iron stove burned a modest diet of dried buffalo chips and sagebrush, using less than a quarter of the fuel Gideon's ruined mansion consumed. Leo sat on his braided rug, drawing pictures on a slate. Grizzly lay stretched out near the hearth, his dark coat warm to the touch, while Martha brewed hot wild mint tea. On the 3rd night of the whiteout, Tobias Carr wiped the frost from a broken window frame in Gideon's ruined mansion and looked toward Dead Man's Gulch. Through the blinding curtain of snow, high on the gravel bench where the wind was fiercest, he saw a single, straight ribbon of gray smoke rising into the sub-zero sky from Arthur's chimney. It did not bend or scatter. It rose straight upward, protected by the heat of the cornstalk walls. "We move now," Tobias shouted over the roar of the gale, wrapping his frozen hands in burlap sacks. "We crawl for that smoke on the gulch, or we die in this ice cave tonight." Desperation gave the freezing group strength they did not know they possessed. Gideon Vance, his wife, his children, and Tobias Carr stepped out into the blinding 35 below whiteout. They could not walk upright. The wind was too violent. They dropped to their hands and knees, crawling through 5 feet of powdery snow toward the single warm chimney in the valley. It was a journey measured in pure agony. Gideon's bare hands bled as he clutched frozen snow crusts. His fine coat was torn to shreds, and his face was a chalk-white mask of advanced frostbite. For nearly an hour, they crawled through the white void, blind, gasping, near death. And then, suddenly, they crossed an invisible boundary. As Gideon dragged himself over the crest of Dead Man's Gulch, the roaring violence of the gale vanished. The screaming wind shot 50 feet over his head, passing harmlessly past the cornstalk walls. He found himself kneeling in a quiet, still basin of air where the snow on the ground was barely 3 inches deep. Before him stood Arthur's cornstalk house, completely unharmed, its vitrified black walls glowing with a warm, golden oil lamp light through the window glass. Gideon stumbled to his feet on trembling legs, staggered up to the front door, and slammed his frost-bitten, bleeding hands against the heavy oak timber. "Arthur!" Gideon sobbed, his voice a pathetic, rasping squeak through frozen lips. "For God's sake! Arthur, help us!" Inside the cabin, Grizzly's ears shot upright. The big dog stood up from his rug, letting out an alert bark toward the door. Arthur did not hurry. He picked up his heavy iron crowbar from the corner, walked to the door, lifted the heavy security latch, and opened the door 6 inches into the night. The warm, 62-degree air from inside the room spilled out into the cold like a golden wave. Kneeling in the shallow snow on his threshold was Gideon Vance, stripped of every shred of his former arrogance. Behind him, Tobias Carr was dragging Gideon's semi-conscious wife and children into the quiet zone beneath the cornstalk walls. "Mercy, Arthur," Gideon wept, holding up his bleeding, frost-blackened hands in open supplication. "Let us in. We're freezing to death." Arthur stood on his dry, warm threshold, holding the iron bar, looking down at the brother who had robbed him of his inheritance, who had given him $12 and told his son to starve, and whose hands had tried to burn his house down weeks earlier. He did not raise the bar, nor did he step back to let them rush inside. "You called this home a beggar's trash pile, Gideon," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the quiet night air with absolute, immovable clarity. "You gave me $12 and sent my boy out to freeze." Gideon wept, hot tears freezing into icy beads on his cheeks. "I was wrong. God help me, Arthur, I was wrong. I'll give you half the farm, half the cattle, half of everything. Just don't leave us out here in the dark." Arthur reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded parchment partnership deed he had prepared weeks earlier, along with a pencil. He laid the paper across Gideon's bleeding knees. "Sign the transfer deed, Gideon. Surrender half of Father's estate back to this family, right now, on the ice." Gideon did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. With trembling, frostbitten fingers, he scribbled his signature across the bottom of the document, dropping the pencil into the snow the moment the last letter was finished. Arthur picked up the signed deed, checked the signature under his lantern light, and slipped it into his pocket. Then he lowered the iron bar, stepped back from the threshold, and opened his door wide to the freezing family. "Martha," Arthur called out quietly over his shoulder as he helped haul his shivering brother across the doorway. "Put the big kettle on the stove and fetch the dry wool blankets. We have guests." The great Arctic blizzard finally released its grip on the Blackwood Valley on the morning of February 15th. When the sun broke over the high prairie ridges for the first time in 4 days, it revealed a landscape that had been entirely rewritten by the storm. The sky was a dazzling pale blue, and the air was deathly still. 5 feet of wind-carved snow buried the valley roads, but inside Dead Man's Gulch, the aerodynamic shape of the cornstalk cabin had done its work. The yard remained clear, and the modest shelter stood dry, warm, and unharmed beneath the morning sun. Throughout the valley, the cost of frontier arrogance was tallied in heavy losses. Down at Gideon's claim, his grand 2-story oak mansion existed only as a charred, snow-filled shell resting in a mound of debris. More than half his cattle herd lay frozen in shattered pens, and 2 timber barns had collapsed under the weight of the ice. Yet inside Arthur Vance's cornstalk house, 9 people woke to the warm morning light streaming through the clean glass windows. Gideon Vance, his family, and Tobias Carr sat around Arthur's small table, drinking hot wild mint tea and eating bowls of warm porridge prepared by Martha. None of them carried the arrogance they had brought to the valley months earlier. Their frostbitten fingers were dressed with pine salve provided by Lydia Finch, who had arrived with a search party from town. Their clothes were dry, and their eyes carried the quiet, humbled look of people who had faced death and survived only by another's grace. Tobias Carr walked outside shortly after breakfast, his boots crunching softly in the shallow snow near the north wall. He stood beneath the eaves, staring up at the vitrified black ceramic glaze where Gideon's men had attempted to burn the house weeks earlier. The head builder pulled an iron hammer from his belt and tapped the black surface. The tool struck with a sharp metallic ring, bouncing off without leaving a single scratch on the stone-hard glaze. Arthur walked out beside him, holding a wooden shovel, Grizzly trotting close to his knees. Tobias looked at the 20-inch thick cornstalk wall, then at Arthur, and shook his head in profound disbelief. "I spent 30 years telling men that pine boards, studs, and tar paper were the only way to build a house, Arthur," Tobias said, his voice low, stripped of all former pride. "I called this place a pigpen and a beggar's barn. I was a fool. You built a fortress out of farm weeds, and it kept 9 souls alive when my timber mansions turned into frozen graves." Arthur looked at the head builder, his dark eyes calm and steady. "It wasn't weeds, Tobias. It was trapped air. The earth gives us what we need if we know how to compress it." Tobias reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small leather notebook, and opened a pencil. "Teach me the recipe, Arthur. Show me how much volcanic ash, how much salt, and how many stakes you used to lock the bales." Arthur smiled quietly. Together, the 2 men stood by the wall for 2 hours as Arthur explained the compression ratios, the staggered joint geometry, and the bioceramic plastering techniques that transformed farm waste into an airtight shield. When the valley roads were cleared a week later, Gideon Vance honored the parchment partnership deed he had signed on Arthur's threshold. Without a single legal argument, 150 head of cattle, 2 grain mills, and half of old Samuel Vance's prime bottomland were officially transferred back into Arthur Vance's name. Gideon never rebuilt his 2-story oak mansion. Broken in spirit and humbled by the storm, he repaired a modest 1-story stone cottage near the river, living quietly on his remaining acreage, his arrogance forever cured by the night he crawled through the snow. When spring finally returned to the Blackwood Valley in May of 1888, the prairie turned emerald green and wild sunflowers bloomed across the slopes of Dead Man's Gulch. The valley did not return to its old ways. When the new construction began that summer, settlers and ranchers from 3 counties did not line up at the timber mills to buy thin pine planks. Instead, long lines of horse-drawn wagons creaked up the trail to Arthur Vance's claim. They came not to mock, but to learn. They stood in Arthur's yard with measuring chains and notebooks, asking about cornstalk compression frames, volcanic ash ratios, and gravel drain trenches. Arthur, Martha, and Lydia Finch turned no one away. Together, they taught every family in the territory how to compress agricultural waste into dense insulation bales, how to lay rock foundations, and how to apply bioceramic plaster that turned weeds into stone. Across the Kansas Territory, compressed stalk and ash chambers became standard winter construction for prairie homesteads, recorded in land office ledgers under a permanent, respected name, the Stalk Vaults. Arthur's claim at Dead Man's Gulch became the most prosperous farm in the county. With his share of his father's estate restored, Arthur built a handsome stone addition onto the original cornstalk house, creating a spacious, warm homestead where his son Leo grew into a fine builder, following his father's footsteps. The nickname Beggar's Barn vanished from local speech forever, remembered only as an embarrassing relic of the town's former ignorance. In historical surveys and local legends passed down through generations of Kansas farmers, the house on the gravel bench was recorded under its true title, the Stalk Fortress. The summer of 1888 brought a different kind of test to the Blackwood Valley, a blistering 98-degree heat wave that baked the Kansas prairie dry under a cloudless, brassy sky. While traditional timber homes in town turned into stifling wooden ovens, trapping heat inside their thin plank walls, Arthur's cornstalk house proved its double-edged brilliance. The same 20-inch cellular dead air insulation that had kept out 35 below Arctic whiteouts prevented the blistering summer heat from penetrating the room. Inside the Stalk Fortress, the air remained a cool, refreshing 65 degrees Fahrenheit all summer long, without a single block of ice or electric fan. Word of the dual-season insulation spread beyond the territory. Architects, agricultural professors, and master builders from as far away as Chicago, St. Louis, and Denver traveled to Dead Man's Gulch. They stood in Arthur's yard with thermometers, draft gauges, and notebooks, measuring the wall density and taking samples of the vitrified volcanic ash and salt plaster. Arthur shared every calculation freely. When an Eastern land company offered him $5,000 for the exclusive patent rights to his bioceramic plaster recipe, Arthur turned them down without a second thought. Keeping a family warm in winter isn't a commodity to be sold, gentlemen, Arthur told the city investors, leaning on his wooden shovel. The earth gave us the ash, the salt, and the stalks. Any man with a pair of hands and a willing heart has the right to build a shelter for his children. Years rolled by across the high plains, bringing prosperous harvests and quiet peace to Dead Man's Gulch. Leo grew into a brilliant young agricultural engineer, attending the state university and eventually publishing the country's first definitive technical manual on cellular insulation and straw bale architecture. His book carried a simple dedication on the front page, "To my father, who taught me that wisdom is found in what others discard." Grizzly, the faithful Newfoundland hybrid, lived out his long life resting comfortably against the vitrified north wall, his heavy coat warm in winter and cool in summer, guarding the family until his peaceful end at 15 years of age. Lydia Finch passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 90, leaving her small woodland claim to Arthur and Martha. They restored her stone cottage, transforming it into the valley's first free community schoolhouse, where Martha taught generations of pioneer children. Decades later, long after the old timber mills had closed and the original wooden mansions in town had rotted away, the original cornstalk house at Dead Man's Gulch stood strong, its vitrified black plaster untouched by decades of prairie rain, wildfire, and Arctic blizzards. The heavy oak door remained in place, bearing the faint, worn marks of the night Gideon Vance had slammed his frost-bitten hands against the timber, begging for entry into the beggar's trash pile he had once mocked. The story of Arthur Vance was never simply about cornstalks, volcanic ash, or 35 below whiteouts. It stood as an enduring, timeless testament to a frontier truth, that nature never surrenders to human pride, and survival is not granted to those who buy the most expensive timber to fight the storm. The greatest protection is often the one hidden beneath the surface, disguised as something ordinary that others discard as trash. And when the great Arctic winter comes to deliver its final judgment, the only witness whose opinion truly matters is the mountain itself.